Thank you so much for allowing to come on the show, Peter. And we're very delighted because you are an elder in the profession, but also we honor you in this profession. You're revered in the profession. And of course, the conversation starts with the Media Council of Uganda and its move to accredit journalists upon covering both the elections and thereafter. The Electoral Commission also issued a circular to all newsrooms as late as Friday, asking newsrooms to submit journalists for accreditation, but those journalists must have Media Council accreditation, and Media Council has yet to give the newsrooms accreditations. But I wanted us to start with discussing the history. You were in the newsroom around 1995 when the Press and Journalists Act came into force. What was the discussion that led to this act?
The Press and Journalists Act, and thank you very much, Raymond, first of all, for having me, and good evening to your viewers. Now, the Press and Journalists Act, was actually a compromise law, that was only able to pass in Parliament because of support from elders now today, like, I remember Kagonyera and so many others. There were very many members of Parliament who had taken an extremist view that the press needed to be fixed. These were madmen, lumpens, fishermen, and so on, who needed to be sorted out with very, very strong laws. So the idea of having a Press and Journalists Act, which created the National Institute of Journalists of Uganda and the Media Council, was some kind of a compromise to say, listen, we have had your concerns and we are trying to address them through professionalizing, journalism. Of course, that had its own challenges, back then and even today, but at least that is what people at the time thought, could be put on the table to allow, to enable those in Parliament who were opposed to, journalists acting the way they used to act in the past, continuing with that. So it really was a compromise. And over the years, it took a while, maybe 2 years or so, before the National Institute of Journalists of Uganda could start operating. Now, that institute basically was the equivalent of, the Uganda Law Society, maybe, or Society of Engineers, and those kinds of associations. Of course, as we shall argue later, it is wrong to make these comparisons in some ways, because journalism is fairly different from some of those professions. The right to freedom of expression, is not just for journalists, it's also for all citizens, So I think it is erroneous for us to sometimes make those comparisons. But anyway, the National Institute of Journalists of Uganda was supposed to have members, journalists enrolling, and those who were supposed to enroll were those who had received a university degree in mass communication, journalism or mass communication, or a university degree in any other subject and a professional qualification in journalism. Those were supposed to be the members of NIJU. And they are the ones who were supposed to basically get enrollment certificates, which were then to be presented to the Media Council, which would go ahead to issue a practicing certificate or license, upon payment of a prescribed fee. That was what the law provided, and that actually happened. In 1997 or thereabouts, Charles Onyango-Bo, who was the editor of the Monitor, was the interim president of the National Institute of Journalists of Uganda. And then a year later, I was the first elected president of the National Institute of Journalists of Uganda. And NIJU actually did work on, the kind of mandate it had been given, not only issuing enrollment certificates to journalists, but also, working on, for instance, publishing a journalism review, organizing trainings for journalists, speaking out on press freedom issues, speaking out on standards, and so on and so forth. And the Media Council at that time actually did issue practicing certificates to those journalists who had enrolled. And of course, at the time it was possible because the whole exercise had the full backing of the New Vision, the biggest media house, the Monitor, and others. So we're actually able to proceed, I think, for about 2 years or thereabouts. But I think along the way, and the presidency of colleagues who came after me, things became a bit harder. I think the Media Council also recognized the challenge that the law had brought. And therefore, there was never any serious effort to continue implementing the law in its form. In any case, the law was under challenge from various groups, perhaps rightly so. So the Media Council never really continued with the registration or licensing of journalists after about 2002, 2003 or thereabouts. And that's how it has been up to this day. Of course, one of my biggest challenges or frustrations with the media in Uganda is that we don't actually cover these issues. You know, how many journalists, let alone the public, know about what the Media Council actually does, who sits on that council, how it is constituted, and whether it's, for instance, fully constituted today. Those are real big problems. And I've said in the past that, you know, we need to do a lot more to, scrutinize the activities of the regulators, including the Media Council and the Uganda Communications Commission. You know, for instance, the UCC doesn't have a tribunal provided for by the law to adjudicate complaints and all that. How do we deal with some of these issues? Who sits to make the decision they are doing today? You know, is that legal or not? I mean, there are so many questions to be asked, and I think the first thing is to make sure that we pay as much attention to these issues as we are paying to the issues of the rights of political candidates and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Peter, if I could ask you most intently now about this new regulation move by the Media Council of Uganda. The Uganda Editors Guild has had a meeting with the Media Council of Uganda where it has impressed upon them that, first of all, the council is not properly constituted because NIJU itself has been almost in abyss for some time. And as a result of that, it's very hard for complaints or even the professional conduct of journalists to be discussed by the Media Council of Uganda. But the Media Council seems intent on having journalists registered before the election can happen. How will there be a balancing act between this regulation move and actually following the law as is required by law?
Yeah, I think that's what's called putting the cart before the horse. I think that there are serious challenges there when it comes to whether the Media Council is fully constituted and whether the Media Council can proceed to register journalists. They are calling it accreditation without NIJU being in existence. You know, there's no journalist today who has an enrollment certificate from the National Institute of Journalists of Uganda. So that's a real serious challenge, and it needs to be addressed. I was part of that meeting that the Editors Guild had with, with the Media Council, and we did raise that and very many other issues. My own sense is that the Media Council should have proceeded with the current practice, what they have been doing, which is they can allow let journalists continue operating how they have been operating. Then institutions like the Electoral Commission, State House, Parliament, and very many others can continue requiring the kind of accreditation, documents that they have always required before journalists can cover, their official events. The idea of requiring everybody who covers a political rally to have a card issued by the Media Council is quite frankly preposterous, because political rallies are open events organized by political parties. These are not Electoral Commission events, even if it is the one which passes the regulations. Those rallies are the main avenue through which political parties communicate with the public. They are one of the ways in which the public participates in their governance, really, quite frankly. So you have no business as a regulator saying that only those who have your card can actually cover those rallies. What are you going to do to all these young bloggers out there? What are you going to do to the political party publicists who have the right actually to communicate what their candidates are saying at all these rallies? Don't get me wrong. It is possible, it is true that some of the people who are using social media, all these new tech, digital platforms, have in some cases actually violated the kind of ethical standards we expect of professional media. One, we recognize they are not professional media. I don't think they should be held to the same standards as you, Raymond, and your colleagues in NTV or at NBS. And I'm not saying that it is okay to have chaos in the whole sector. No. All I'm saying is that we must rethink our regulation based on the realities of today. And whatever we do, regulation must first of all be independent. It must be done by a body that is independent. These are principles that are in several protocols that Uganda is a signatory to. Secondly, regulation must be accountable, not to the president, not to the ruling party, not to the government. It must be accountable to the citizens through parliament. Okay. Thirdly, regulation must be transparent. We must be able to know who actually is making these decisions. We must be able to know when the Media Council makes directives, like the ones they did recently. Did the whole council sit? Are there minutes that show that the whole council sat and agreed that this is the way to go? Or are these the actions of just my good friend Paulo and a few others? And I'm not saying anything, about the integrity of Paulo Ekochu, the chairman of the council. He's a good man, quite frankly. But the point is, they are operating under a framework that is neither clear nor desirable. I don't think this is a time for us to actually put a gag on those who are covering the elections. Yes, there have been challenges with, the way some of these digital platforms have covered, the elections, the violence that, erupted after Bobby Wine was arrested. There are some issues there. But actually, I'll remind you, do you remember who the president, when the president last addressed the nation on that Sunday evening, and asked his team to play back clips, video clips, showing excesses by both the police and security forces and protesters. Who actually recorded those clips? Were they State House clips? No. Were they Media Council clips? No. Those were clips recorded by ordinary Ugandans who are not journalists. Those Ugandans have the right to record what is going on in their country. They have the right to receive information. They have the right to disseminate information about what is going on. We can use the current law to challenge some of the content they may put out, but we cannot deny them the right to participate in this election. That is wrong.
Peter, the elephant in the room, and you've rightly said, the elephant in the room currently is that there are online media houses which are currently covering candidate Robert Kyagulanyi live almost every 18 hours of his campaign. And that campaign is being met by violence from state actors and the like. The crisis is that what is carried in commentary, and this is what the Media Council has been saying, that what is carried in commentary by these online media houses is inciting of violence. That's what they say. And as a result, they say that it's easier if we had everyone regulated so that they can cover the campaign rather than have people who cannot be brought to the book using the same law. Do you think that that is from a good heart? Is it from a good heart, or it's actually from a point of censorship?
The concern that they have about some of the commentaries that have been put out there in the public domain is a legitimate concern. But we must be realistic and reasonable. We are told by UCC now, I think, that between 17 to 20 million Ugandans have, cell phones. Let us, just for argument's sake, let us say actually that only 10 million unique Ugandans have cell phones. Is the UCC, the Media Council, telling us they are going to regulate all these Ugandans? Because it is very easy for any one of these Ugandans to record what is going on when soldiers are shooting at people, when Bobi Wine is being arrested, when Amuriat is being tear gassed, and post it on YouTube, on Facebook, and so on. Are they going to require the registration of all journalists? Because you see, what they have done, ordinarily there would be no serious problem with a question of accreditation, like I've said, accreditation for official events. In fact, it has always happened, and we have never had any discussion, any controversy about it. That's how it happens here and elsewhere in Africa, you know. The point is, it appears to me the council and police has actually said exactly that. The council is trying to use the registration of journalists to exclude ordinary people who want to participate in these elections, and that is wrong. Because you see, and I've argued before the council, I mean, at least before the chairman, that you see, I am okay as a compromise with you issuing journalists with these cards and all that, if you think it is going to help protect them from police attacking them. But police has a responsibility to protect all Ugandans, whether they have cards or not. The idea of using this card to deny access to a party publicist, deny access to a blogger, a citizen journalist, a vlogger, and that is a plain wrong. And I think that we need to sit down and rethink this whole thing. For the moment, my view is that we should all perhaps condemn any communication, expression that we think goes beyond what is acceptable and justifiable. We could, encourage the public to, about the importance of verifying information that they receive and share. We should definitely discourage expression that clearly incites ethnic discord and violence and those kinds of things. But we cannot do that by denying people the right to express themselves. That is plain wrong. We have got to sit down and figure out a way, and I don't think we can do that within the remaining days before the elections. So in my view, the Media Council should go slow. We should rethink this whole system of regulation going forward under the new government, that will swear in May, and, figure out a way in which we can actually regulate not just mainstream media, but also social media. It is a challenge all over the world. It isn't just a Ugandan challenge.
Peter, you've been an editor in elections, many elections before, and many editors now are actually staring at having almost half or almost all their newsroom not being able to meet the criteria that the Media Council is asking of the newsrooms to be able to register as accredited journalists. And that, of course, has impacts on how much the media can do in covering the elections and even the transmission of the results, which is coming up 3 weeks from now. What do you propose as the way forward for media houses?
Precisely because of all these challenges. I mean, the Media Council must operate, any regulator must operate within the realities of, the environment within which they exercise their mandate. We don't have the requirements that the law put up, partly because we took our eyes off the ball those many years ago, for whatever reasons, Now is the time to sit down and say, going forward, how do we actually ensure that, we have a semblance of order in this industry? You don't stop people from, covering this election just simply because, you have the mandate to do that, especially given that, as we have pointed out, the Media Council itself is not fully constituted. The National Institute of Journalists of Uganda is not in place. These media houses have invested money to, bring information to Ugandans. I mean, to come up now and tell them, you cannot actually cover these elections is really, really plain wrong. They must, encourage them to ensure that their journalists have the training that is required, the knowledge to cover politics and all that. We don't really have to go to extremes when it comes to addressing some of these concerns about standards. The issue is to make sure that we all agree that there is some regulation is important. Nobody is saying it's not important, but that at the end of it all, regulation should not be used to stifle the right to freedom of expression. Regulation should actually be used to promote the right to freedom of expression. And our courts, the Supreme Court, has been very clear on that issue in that famous 2004, judgment, Joseph Mulenga, Onyango Obo, and Andrew Mwenda versus the Attorney General. So really, I think that we must continue having discussions. I don't think it's realistic for the council to proceed on the route that they have taken. We should continue having this discussion, and we actually have been discussing, by the way, behind the scenes. Of course, Raymond, I must also tell you that it is a bit frustrating in some cases when you are dealing with an industry like ours, where many of the owners, your owners may be okay, who knows, but many of the media owners in this country, don't have the constitution, the backbone to speak truth to power, to stand up for the rights of the media, for the rights of citizens. So quietly, even as many of us are making noise here and there, quietly, many of them have already appeared, and they are, busy sending lists of their journalists, you know, and obviously they are excluding, they are going to end up having newsrooms that can't actually operate, because elections, I mean, a huge undertaking. Covering elections, I mean, it's a huge undertaking. I mean, very few newsrooms have the resources to be everywhere. Not even Vision Group or Nation Media Group, our biggest media houses, have the resources to be everywhere. And that is precisely why, you know, it is very important for ordinary people to also participate in this, as long as they are not going beyond what is acceptable. I'll give you an example why it is very important to have ordinary people. Very many of you, Raymond, not you individually, but very many of you in television, for instance, have misread the regulation that, or guideline that the Uganda Communications Commission issued about live broadcasting of certain events like protests, demonstrations, or what some call riots. Okay, my own reading of it is that no, there is actually no ban on live coverage of demonstrations. The issue is you have been cautioned to ensure that when you do so, you have the resources to be able to edit, you know, messages that may actually be insightful and unacceptable. Okay, that kind of thing. But now, most of your media houses have read this as, you know, a directive banning live broadcasting. Now, in the absence of the young people who are at these protests, for instance, covering them with their cell phones and all that, Ugandans would not have had, you know, the realities of what actually went on. The president himself didn't get those messages from security. He got them from the recordings made by Ugandans, you know, young people who were appalled by what they were seeing being done in the name of protecting them from COVID-19. Huh?
Thank you so much, Peter, for agreeing to speak to us in this interview and for shedding a very, very bright light on the Media Council of Uganda and the regulation of media houses. We hope to have you on the show some other time in much more normal circumstances, probably in our studios, and to talk to you at length. But also thank you so much for always standing for the media where the need has always arisen.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, Raymond. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you so much for joining us on Fourth Estate, Melina. And very, very fastly to start with, the research that you've done on Uganda, what does it tell you about behavioral patterns? What does it tell you about COVID-19 particularly and Uganda?
Sure, thank you so much, Raymond, for having me on the show. I've been working with a team of researchers to study the impact of COVID-19 in Uganda and also behaviors and perceptions about COVID-19. And the study that I've primarily been working on has focused on Kampala City. So all of our respondents are residents of Kampala. But I just want to say there's also many other studies, over a dozen of them, that look at very similar questions. And I know some of those results too that I'm happy to share. And those paint a much broader picture from across Uganda, some of them focusing on particular districts, some of them nationally representative. But broadly, what we've found, at least in the Kampala survey, is that people, you know, from quite early on had very good information about COVID-19, about how it's transmitted, the preventive behaviors that they can take, preventive measures they can take. Obviously, we found fairly severe economic impacts, which everyone is fairly well aware of by now and has been probably impacted directly. And over time, what we've seen is that in general, there is basically broad kind of support for government efforts. There's basically high ratings of government performance, particularly the Ministry of Health and the President, and somewhat lower perceptions for members of parliament and LC1s, for example. But overall, based on what we've done, we've seen that people are pretty, they're okay with what the government has been doing so far. However, at the same time, we've seen that actual practice of the preventive behaviors that would prevent the spread of COVID-19. Some studies have found that these behaviors have been declining. People are practicing them less. And in our study as well, I think people were most vigilant in the early days, say in May, June, during the lockdown period. People were really vigilant. They were really concerned about getting COVID-19, when in fact, actually the risk of getting it at that point was fairly low. The cases were low. There wasn't widespread community spread. And now, unfortunately, we see that people, you know, understandably get tired of practicing these behaviors, which are quite taxing, at precisely the moment, unfortunately, when the cases are increasing, and in fact, the risk is much higher than it was when they were being much more vigilant.
If you could talk to us about the kinds of information that people were dealing with. At the start of the pandemic, the Ugandan media did a great deal at pumping out information, infomercials, almost at top of the hour. They were providing kinds of information that the public could work with. That kind of information has reduced now. It isn't in much supply as it was then. Could part of the behavior be linked towards the behavior of the Ugandan media towards the pandemic?
I think it's the behavior of many different people. So at the beginning of the pandemic, as you mentioned, there were artists, there were musicians who came out with songs, government officials, there were regular statements being made. You could see artists on the street who had painted images and you know, suggesting and encouraging people to practice SOPs, for example. And I think collectively, when you hear it from so many different sides, and also when you see other people practicing these behaviors, you're more likely to do it yourself. And so I think the information part, it's not that people have forgotten or don't know now what they should be doing or what would be useful. It's not the information necessarily that is the problem. In other words, people don't lack information about how it's transmitted. They don't really lack information about the symptoms. They're quite aware of those things. The sense that I get is what's missing is the general feeling coming from different sides, from your friends, from other members of the public, from leadership, from the media potentially, you know, to remind you that this is still a very urgent, pressing issue. And that, you know, when you observe people walking on the street and they're not wearing masks, they're not keeping distance, you know, you tend to be less likely to do so yourself. So I think it's a whole collective that your behavior, especially with something like mask wearing, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable, nobody really likes doing it. And if you're the only one walking around wearing a mask and nobody else is doing it, you feel, you know, basically what's the point, kind of. So it's the need to get more people, including the media, but more people in general to be actively practicing and actively encouraging other people to be practicing these behaviors.
Melina, one of the other stories that has come out of COVID-19 is the impact it had on people's incomes. Just basic incomes, being able to survive. What does your data, what does your research say about incomes of individuals affected by this COVID-19?
Sure. So there have been, as I mentioned, a number of studies looking at this from across the country. And the best studies are the ones that have a measure of what was income like before the pandemic and what was income like afterward, and ideally track this over time. So what many of these studies have found is that there was a severe shock during the lockdown period, which you can imagine why that was the case, especially in urban areas where people, you know, have businesses, and if the business is closed, they're not making any income whatsoever. They don't have maybe a farm to rely on that they can continue to get their own food. It really hits especially urban residents very hard. So we saw that extreme shock during the lockdown period. And some studies have found that this actually has improved somewhat in the months since. So one of the studies that's currently ongoing, that's a combination of the Uganda Bureau of Statistics and the World Bank. This is a nationally representative survey that's been, there's been 4 rounds conducted so far, starting in June, and the 5th round is currently in the field right now. And what they've found is that there has been some rebound in people's livelihoods, and kind of the economic effects aren't as severe as they were, say, in May, June, but people are still obviously heavily affected. People have spent down their savings, and so they don't have that buffer that they went into the beginning of 2020 with, for example. So I would say things seem to be somewhat better than they were during the lockdown period, but they're certainly not back to normal.
Melina, one of the stories for the Ugandan media particularly, when we talk about incomes, not just household incomes have gone down, government income has also gone down. Government has now really adopted austerity measures, reduced its spending only to wages and salaries. And the problem with that is that it has a trickle-down effect to the population. From what you can tell with your research, is the future ahead brighter, or should people actually tighten their belts for a very tough 2021?
I think it's going to be, some people are saying, I can't wait for 2020 to end, let it end, let's bring in 2021, it'll be a better year. I think it will be better in a number of ways, especially with the news we've had in the past couple of weeks about several vaccines being approved. This is going to start to change a lot of things in the global economy that are going to have, I think, trickle-down effects, broadly speaking, around the world. But there's not going to be, a moment or a day or a week when all of a sudden it's like you switch the faucet back on and things proceed as usual. I think it's going to be a very slow return. And some people, we've seen this in countries around the world, especially, business people. If your business has been heavily enough affected, if you had to shut down, you may not be able to start again. So there are some things that can't be recovered. And so I think, 2021, if I had to guess, and based on what we've seen, should be better, but it's certainly not going to be a complete rebound. And I suspect, globally, it's going to be really slow and incremental progress, which of course has implications for Uganda's economy as well, and the government spending and government budget that you mentioned. So hopefully it'll be somewhat better, but it's not going to be magically on January 1st, things are going to be much better than they were.
Melina, you've put out incredible research on COVID-19 now, the data that we read, but you've also interacted with Ugandan media before. If you were to sit in an editor's position to try and refocus the reporting on COVID-19 based off of what you've learned with this research, what kind of focus do you think a newsroom should be taking at the moment?
I think newsrooms have obviously been influenced and incentivized to focus on the election, which is coming up next month, which is completely understandable and is the main thing anyway on many people's minds. I think the issue, or maybe one way of thinking about it, is that the election and COVID-19 are not totally separate topics. They're not unrelated to each other. In fact, they're quite related. You can think of this in a variety of ways. For example, do people's perceptions about government performance with respect to COVID-19, how well have they performed in addressing the pandemic, in assisting people? Is this going to affect how people vote, for example? One of the things we've seen in our study in Kampala, as well as the study that I mentioned conducted by UBOS and the World Bank, is that there are concerns about limits on personal freedoms or individual freedom. So people are concerned about the effect of politics on COVID-19 and COVID-19 on politics in both directions. And one of the concerns people have is that this provides the kind of measures that are being undertaken can be used to limit people's individual freedoms. So this is kind of a widespread concern, and we can see this in kind of coverage of the campaigns and whether or not certain candidates are allowed to campaign or be in certain places or not. So these two issues are related. So I would say, the media doesn't have to just focus on the election or on COVID-19. They're really actually extremely related. Also, we've seen in the case of the United States, people have looked at what is the effect of campaigns on the spread of COVID-19. So there's been some research that tries to measure or quantify what is the effect of holding a rally on the number of COVID-19 cases. And so, for example, one study in the US, this was conducted by economists at Stanford University, looked at 18 rallies that were held by President Trump in the campaigns leading up to the US election, and estimated that this ultimately resulted in probably about 700 additional deaths due to COVID-19. And so, these two issues are related. And so that would be kind of one suggestion I have, for media houses, is to treat these things not as either or, should we focus on COVID or should we focus on the elections, but really to see how these two interact with one another. So that's one thing. Another is thinking into the future and beyond the election period. I know that's kind of all anyone can think about right now, but beyond the election, COVID will still be here. The day after the election, the weeks after the election, maybe the campaigns will be done, but COVID will still be here. And based on what I just mentioned, it's likely to be worse than it is currently. We've seen this in the US, which is, to be fair, the US has done worse than many other countries, but you can imagine that things are will continue not to be looking very good on the COVID-19 front in Uganda. So what does the future hold? What does the rest of 2021 look like? And for this, we need to focus first on behavior. So these things I mentioned, what do we know about what can increase the practice of key SOPs like wearing masks, like maintaining social distancing? How can we get more people to be practicing these behaviors? So that's one thing. And then looking a little bit more into the future, looking at the vaccine. So there's one question we asked in the most recent survey, which was just conducted in the past few weeks, in early December, again, of Kampala residents. And we asked people, if a vaccine were to become available, how likely would you be to take it? And about 80% of people said they would take it, which, on the one hand seems like a pretty high number. On the other hand, it means that about 20% of people didn't feel comfortable taking it. The reasons why they said they weren't comfortable included, concerns about side effects of the vaccines, general concerns that vaccines don't really work. So there needs to be some thought that goes into what does the messaging look like to get people on board with vaccines. And here, we ask people as well, who would you trust to provide information to kind of convince you that this is the right thing to do? And overwhelmingly, people mention medical professionals. So they're interested in doctors, they're interested in the Ministry of Health, they're interested in these types of professionals, medical professionals, to give them advice. So that's something, going forward, I think the media could focus on, is really trying to work with the medical community in Uganda and also the research community. There's a huge community of researchers who work in clinical research, especially with history dating back to the HIV pandemic, and also before that. There's a huge resource to draw from in terms of expertise, and this can really be used to make the public potentially more comfortable with a vaccine. So I think those are some of the things that I would look to. And then finally, more generally, investigating what are the plans for how this is going to work, for how the distribution is going to work, how is it going to reach across the country? Who is it going to reach? A big discussion recently has been, who has access to the vaccine, especially in lower income countries. There's a facility called COVAX, which basically will guarantee about 20% of the population will have access to the vaccine, but that's not a very large percentage. So who is going to get that limited supply, at least in the beginning? So I think these are some of the questions we should be asking and kind of probing the government to, provide some information about what is the plan for when this is eventually rolled out. What does 2021 look like for us? Those are some of the questions I would be asking.
Melina, if I could ask you very finally, on the vaccine efforts, we saw this week Gavi actually authored documents internally that would suggest it may not be possible for them to distribute the vaccine to developing countries as quick and fast as developing countries need them. Uganda already has an application in the pipeline together with all the East African countries to be able to access this vaccine. In the event that the vaccine doesn't become readily available for African countries, but also in the event that this global competition for the vaccine continues, what will the role of the media be? Shall we go back to Western media versus African media style narratives on how the vaccine should be distributed, who should get the vaccine and how should they get it? Do you have any solutions for how the reporting should be handled now?
I would go back to an earlier point that I made, which is to continue to draw on local expertise. Uganda in particular has a very rich history of medical research and expertise. So Uganda UVRI, for example, has done a lot of research. There's a huge body of professionals who can speak to this issue, and I would focus on those people who know the context best, who know the history best, who have been in this field for a really long time, rather than continuing to look to, the West, so to speak. So I would draw from their expertise more, and I would also you know, again, going back to a previous point, is really emphasizing that, you know, this is true for all countries, including ones that will have greater access to the vaccine earlier on, that practicing, you know, these behavioral measures is going to be critical, even after the vaccine. And I think kind of preparing people for what the vaccine world looks like. What does it look like when 20% of the people have the vaccine? What does it look like when 50%? Even then, even if 80% of the people have it, it's likely we'll still have to be practicing some of these unpleasant behaviors. And so kind of getting people in the right mindset for thinking about this as a really long-term process. Like I mentioned before, it's not that one day, you know, we receive a vaccine and then everything is all over. It's a much longer process. And so I think addressing people's expectations is really key. I think this is maybe one area where things didn't go quite as well in the early days of the pandemic in Uganda. I think there was a sense that if we do this lockdown, if we, you know, we do this really stringent measure for a certain number of weeks or months, then we'll be done. Like then it'll be okay and we can go about our lives and we'll have beaten it. And I think the challenge with that is obviously that wasn't the case. It might have worked for some types of viruses, maybe Ebola. There's some types of viruses that would have actually worked with. This wasn't one of them. And so what happened, I think, is that people got tired. And they got frustrated and they were really worn down economically as well. So when you finally lift these measures, people kind of go back to their normal lives, more or less. And so I think that was about expectations. What is the expectation you provide people with about what is the future going to look like? What do I need you to do now? How long do I need you to do it for? These sorts of things. So I would think about, you know, in the conversation about vaccines broadly, is kind of painting expectations and painting a picture for people of what the future is going to look like. And this is something that the media can do, but also pushing government officials, I think, to provide a clear picture of what they, you know, what they expect people to do, and, you know, the role the public can play in all of these processes.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to us, Melina, and thank you so much for sparing your time to be able to appear on the Fourth Estate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Raymond.